In addition to having spatial problems generated from vestibular or cognitive misinterpretations, visual illusions created by changes in object viewing angles can also lead to severe in-flight spatial disorientation. Among these types of cognitive threats, what has been known as the black hole illusion approach is recognized as one of the most common and dangerous forms of spatial disorientation. Enabling objectives presented over the course of this training are designed to help pilots define the spatial strategies used during day and night landings, identify the factors that increase the risk of making a low and fast black hole approach, and identify how to recognize and avoid visual illusions that occur with black hole landing conditions. Following an early morning pre-dawn launch and a brief 45-minute transit, a commercial cargo jet piloted by a reserve naval aviator and a senior civilian airline captain began a scheduled landing approach to a Southwest Florida regional airport. Although it was early morning, they were still flying in nighttime conditions with calm winds and relatively clear weather with 9 miles of visibility. After descending and holding at 3,000 feet, the crew reported they had the runway in sight as they arrived at a point 8.5 nautical miles west and 5.7 nautical miles north of the airfield. Unfortunately, when the first officer began to nose the aircraft over to initiate their landing descent, he failed to realize he was geographically disoriented, and the beacon light he had identified as a runway was instead a set of bright lights surrounding a paper mill several miles south of the airfield. For the next 3.5 minutes, the pilot flew the aircraft in a slight turning descent toward the paper mill. However, when they reached a point 4.6 nautical miles from the airfield at 1,800 feet above ground level, the first officer suddenly realized his mistake and began to correct their flight path. To intersect the proper approach path, he initiated a 45-degree left heading change and simultaneously sharply lowered the aircraft nose to reset his aim point on the runway. After the heading correction, which was accomplished with a steady increase in downward pitch, the first officer was able to successfully line up with the runway at a distance of 3.5 nautical miles and a height of 900 feet above ground level. Although the aircraft was still at this point technically within the FAA's runway glide slope limits, the pilot unintentionally lined up on a glide path that was 0.8 nautical miles short of the runway threshold. As the distance of the runway decreased from 3.4 to 1.8 nautical miles, the flight path remained relatively stable. However, despite having the runway clearly in sight, the pilot's aim point was still a half nautical mile in front of the threshold. Upon reaching a distance of 1.8 nautical miles, the pilot's disorientation seemed to worsen as he further decreased their runway approach angle, which was already well below the FAA minimum safe limit. At this point, the first officer suddenly recognized his below glide slope error and stated to the captain who was flying as co-pilot, "I'm going to have to stay a little bit higher or I'm going to lose the end of the runway." As the runway distance decreased further from 1.8 to 1.4 nautical miles, the first officer attempted to correct their flight path error by adding more power. He raised the aircraft nose in an attempt to shift his aim point forward toward the runway. However, their trajectory remained 1,500 feet short of the runway, and the aircraft continued to fall further below the minimum safe approach path. When they reached a point 1.5 miles from the airfield, the captain, who had been monitoring the instruments, looked up at the runway and commented, "It's starting to disappear." During the 10 seconds it took to transfer from 1 to a little over half nautical mile, the pilot continued to hold a constant approach angle to an impact point 1,500 feet short of the runway. As the runway approach angle decayed to less than 1 degree instead of the required 3 degrees, the aircraft descended to just 38 feet above ground level, and it would still have been possible to land safely on the runway if the flight path had been free of obstructions. Unfortunately, a half mile from the runway threshold, the aircraft came in contact with a row of 40-foot tall pine trees, and the impact damage that occurred caused the aircraft to crash to the ground 1,500 feet short of the runway. Seconds after the wrecked aircraft came to a stop, the engines burst into flame and the fuel-fed fire started to spread forward toward the crew compartment. Fortunately, all 3 flight crew members were able to escape through the cockpit side window before the cabin became engulfed in flames. Later, during the post-mishap investigation, the insidious nature of black hole illusion and its role in the mishap became very apparent when the aircraft captain later reported that prior to impact, the last thing he remembered was, "Everything visually looked normal based on the runway, and that's why I was somewhat shocked when I felt the thumping." Several days after the crash, the National Transportation Safety Board began an investigation to determine the mishap causal factors and to also identify what actions could be implemented to prevent future accidents of this type. After carefully reviewing the mishap evidence, the board concluded the landing approach, flown at night over dark unlit ground, created black hole visual conditions that contributed to the flight crew's spatial disorientation and controlled flight into the terrain. In conflict with the standard operating requirements, the flight crew had also failed to establish a stabilized approach path by the time the airplane descended below 500 feet above ground level. The board also reported that the captain and first officer's state of fatigue contributed to their degraded performance, and the first officer's color vision deficiency may have made it more difficult for him to correctly interpret the altitude indications of the precision approach path indicator lights positioned on the side of the runway. The purpose of this training module is to teach pilots how to recognize and avoid unintentionally low runway approaches associated with black hole approach visual illusions. Since this illusion is widely accepted as both a dangerous and frequently reoccurring problem, it is important to be able to recognize and avoid this deadly form of spatial disorientation. A black hole approach can be defined as an unintentionally low flight path during landing conditions that involve a highly visible, well-illuminated runway with few if any surrounding ground references and little or no outside horizon cues. Typically, these conditions occur at night. However, with daytime landing approaches involving foggy or near IFR conditions, black hole visual illusions can still present a serious threat during daylight hours. Navy and Marine Corps pilots report black hole-type visual illusions are the second most commonly encountered visual problem, surpassed only by misinterpretation of false horizons. Surveys of U.S. Air Force pilots reveal similar results that identified dangerously low black hole approaches as the most commonly encountered in-flight visual spatial problem. Consistent with the accident statistics and the experience encountered by the 727 mishap crew, simulator data recently collected by Navy researchers has confirmed that during night approaches, even highly qualified pilots are susceptible to errors created by black hole visual illusions. For general aviation, low visibility encountered during approaches, landings, and low-altitude flight has also been reported as a causal factor with over 70% of the commercial accidents, and further analysis by the NTSB indicates the accident rate for night landing operations is 3 times greater than the rate reported for daytime conditions. Since AeroMedical researchers have determined that well-defined spatial strategies are essential for recognition and prevention of black hole illusion, as well as other types of disorientation, it is important to understand how sight-picture dynamics significantly impact pilot spatial awareness. In general terms, the word spatial strategy refers to having a plan of action aimed at achieving a particular goal. However, when applied to spatial problems, a spatial strategy may be defined as a cognitive process that allows one to sense spatial patterns for the purpose of predicting and manipulating future spatial positions. When describing in-flight spatial relationships, the term sight picture is often used to explain how visual cues interact within a pilot's field of view. Researchers have further determined that in order to develop an effective spatial strategy, a pilot's sight picture must have a minimum of 2 specific visual components defined as primary and secondary spatial cues. The term primary spatial cue refers to a visual reference that is stabilized on the retina either on or near a pilot's central field of view, and secondary spatial cues are defined as unstabilized peripheral images that will often appear in motion relative to the centered primary cue. During solo flights with visual meteorological conditions, distant aim points situated on or near the outside horizon typically serve as a pilot's primary spatial cue, and peripheral views of the aircraft structures, such as the glare shield, canopy bows, or wings, play a vital role as secondary spatial cues. In many situations, pilots will consciously and sometimes unconsciously determine aircraft orientation by comparing visual distances or angles between these 2 cues. Also, when the spatial differences between these cues changes within a pilot's sight picture, the direction and rate of change provides critical visual feedback that helps with control input decisions related to aircraft attitude and velocity. With daylight VMC landing approaches, images of the horizon and the peripherally viewed glare shield provide primary and secondary cues during initial airfield lineups. However, once the approach is stabilized, the runway landing point becomes the foveal aim point, which then makes it the primary spatial cue. In this case, the horizon does continue to serve as an important spatial reference during VMC approaches. However, when the center foveal position shifts to the runway aim point, the off-foveal horizon becomes what is known as a tertiary rather than a primary spatial cue. During fixed-angle approaches, visual separation of the horizon, the runway aim point, and the glare shield remain constant. However, as the airfield distance decreases within the sight picture, the changing visual angles will cause the peripheral view of the runway threshold to drift lower as the far-end runway image simultaneously moves higher at a slightly slower rate. During daytime VMC, clear visibility of the horizon and the runway help prevent spatial misperceptions that can occur with changing visual angles. However, when darkness obscures both the horizon and runway touchdown point, pilots are forced to transition to other spatial cues within their sight picture. At night, with a dark runway surface and no visible horizon, pilots are forced to estimate their landing aim point using visual angle interpretations of the runway perimeter lights. Of special importance are the runway threshold lights, which often serve as a substitute horizontal reference and thereby become a default primary spatial cue. Unfortunately, with a normal 3-degree approach, this spatial strategy can be problematic because, unlike a real horizon that moves backward in space as an aircraft moves forward, the runway threshold is a fixed ground point that during a normal approach will appear in a pilot's sight picture below the runway aim point. Consequently, as the distance to the airfield decreases, the changing visual angle will cause the threshold image to slowly drift downward toward the glare shield. Since novice pilots are often correctly taught that during day VMC, maintaining their horizontal reference at a fixed distance above the glare shield will ensure a constant glide slope. On a dark night with no visible horizon, it would be understandable as to why some pilots might attempt using a similar spatial strategy that substitutes the runway threshold as a horizontal reference. Because a fixed 3-degree landing approach angle will cause the runway visual angle to expand as distance and altitude decrease, aeromedical researchers believe black hole illusion errors occur when pilots attempt to keep the runway visual angle constant rather than letting it expand. Unfortunately, in this situation, the only way a pilot can maintain a constant sight picture of the runway threshold is to slightly increase the aircraft's downward pitch angle as the distance to the runway decreases. Investigators have documented that low and fast night approaches are frequently caused by 3 types of sequential misperceptions that generate a combination of black hole control input errors. The first type of error, referred to as excess pushover, usually occurs at the beginning of a night landing approach when an aircraft is first transitioning from a wings level to nose-down attitude. Research data indicates that during approach initiation, there is often a tendency for pilots to use excessive pitch-down control inputs that are followed with inadequate pitch-up recovery. This type of error typically lasts for only a few seconds. However, it often causes an unintended drop in altitude that makes selection of a proper glide path aim point more difficult. The second type of black hole perceptual error involves improper aim point selection during initial stabilization of the landing approach. If a pilot commits an excess pushover maneuver during approach initiation, it is usually followed with a rapid nose-up recovery and an attempt to stabilize the aircraft on an approach path to the runway. Unfortunately, when pilots are experiencing black hole conditions, after completing the nose-up recovery, there is often a tendency towards stabilizing the glide path on an aim point trajectory short of the runway threshold. The reason this approach error typically occurs at night instead of during the day is with daylight conditions, pilots receive spatial information from visual ground texture beneath the glide path, and they also have the advantage of being able to view the optimum aim point defined by the runway heading numbers and painted landing box stripes. Since the landing box, as well as the entire runway surface, is usually not illuminated during night landings, selecting the proper 3-degree runway aim point is more difficult because pilots have to estimate their runway landing point using visual angle interpretations of the glare shield and runway perimeter lights. Since pilots know they must cross over the threshold lights to safely land on the runway at night, without a well-defined horizon or visible runway touchdown point, the illuminated threshold lights are likely to become a default horizontal reference that will directly influence aim point estimates. For this reason, visual placement of the threshold image on the windscreen relative to the cockpit glare shield becomes a critical spatial factor for correctly, or in some cases incorrectly, setting both the aim point and glide path angle. If a pilot commits an excess pushover maneuver and then follows it up with an improper aim point selection, the third type of black hole error that is often encountered is failure to recognize the incorrect aim point. The first two types of errors are usually of short duration and typically involve large pitch control inputs that occur within the first few seconds of an approach initiation. In contrast, the third type of black hole error, involving failure to recognize an incorrect aim point, usually takes place over a period of several minutes, and when recognized, typically involves a slow rather than rapid recovery. The risk for encountering the third type of error is highest at the beginning of an approach because the sight picture differences between a correctly or incorrectly placed aim point become smaller with increased distance. As an example, if a pilot selects a 3-degree runway glide path from a distance of 8 nautical miles, the sight picture difference between setting the windscreen aim point position on the runway ILS or 1,000 feet short of the threshold is less than 1/10 of an inch. Consequently, without proper instrumentation such as an ILS display or PAPI approach lights, a small error in initial aim point placement is usually quite difficult to recognize during the first few minutes of a visual night landing approach. With regard to the 727 crashing short of the runway on night approach, when the pilot at the controls realized he had mistakenly lined up on a paper mill beacon instead of the runway, his heading correction also included an abrupt pushover maneuver to reset his aim point toward the runway. Unfortunately, at this point, the mishap pilot committed a black hole Type 1 excess pushover error, which he then followed up with a Type 2 improper aim point selection error. After committing these two sequential errors 4 nautical miles from the airfield, they were still technically within the 3-degree runway glide slope limits. However, the pilot's improper aim point selection inadvertently placed the aircraft on an approach path to the ground over a half nautical mile short of the runway threshold. By the time they came within 1 nautical mile of the runway, the aircraft had fallen to 100 feet below glide path minimums, and both pilots remained under the influence of the third type of black hole misperception. They failed to recognize their aim point was still a half mile short of the threshold, and contact with the 40-foot pine trees located 3/4 of a mile from the runway was their first indication they had become victims of the black hole illusion. Based upon the 727 mishap flight crew's actions, it appears that in addition to committing all 3 black hole spatial errors, both pilots were disoriented by the runway fixed visual angle illusion, often described in existing AeroMedical training literature. In the early 1960s, researchers discovered that during a normal fixed-angle approach, the visual angle created by the near and far ends of the runway expands as the approach distance and altitude decreases. For example, with a 3-degree approach beginning at 8 nautical miles, the runway visual angle almost doubles after reaching 4 nautical miles and triples at 2 nautical miles. Based on this visual phenomenon, accident investigators started to hypothesize that black hole illusion accidents occurred because pilots failed to allow the runway visual angle to expand and instead tried to keep the view of the runway angle constant by progressively increasing their nose-down attitude. When a pilot starts a 3-degree approach from 8 nautical miles and attempts to keep the runway visual angle constant, at 4 nautical miles the aircraft will be 500 feet below the optimum 3-degree glide path. If the disoriented pilot continues to keep the runway angle constant, at 2 nautical miles, the aircraft will be 400 feet below glide path and without a rapid recovery, only a few seconds away from ground impact. Although the 727 mishap data indicates the first officer flew an excessively low glide path that resulted in the runway visual angle remaining relatively fixed, due to the distance from which the pilot control errors first appeared, it is likely this visual phenomenon was a secondary factor that reinforced the black hole aim point errors committed during the first half of the approach. Although the 727 first officer was dealing with fatigue, color vision deficiency, and lack of familiarity with the mishap airfield, he could have easily avoided crashing short of the runway if he had better understood the sight picture dynamics that create black hole illusions. Instead of committing the first type of black hole error, if the first officer had made a more gradual pushover maneuver at the onset of his approach, he would have avoided what became a sudden and unintended drop in altitude, which then made it more difficult to correctly set his aim point on the runway. Also, the first officer could have avoided flying a dangerously low mishap approach path if he had realized that using only outside visual cues to set his aim point was a high-risk decision. At the beginning of the approach, the first officer committed the second type of black hole error when he inadvertently set the runway image on the windscreen 1 inch too high. From 4 miles out, this slight misplacement in the sight picture adjustment was enough to create an aim point error that placed the aircraft on a glide slope trajectory more than 1 nautical mile short of the threshold. If either the pilot or co-pilot had adequately cross-checked their instruments or paid closer attention to the PEPI light indications, it would have helped them reset their aim point on the runway instead of keeping it short of the threshold. Also, if they'd chosen to use the available runway that was equipped with an instrument landing system, the risk for committing any type of black hole control error would have been significantly reduced. To help avoid making black hole control errors during night landings, pilots should remain aware that during initial approach transitions from wings level to a nose-down attitude, at night there is a tendency to briefly use excessive pitch-down control inputs that may be followed up with inadequate pitch-up recovery. With excess nose-over maneuvers, it can result in unintended loss of altitude that may make it more difficult to estimate the correct runway aim point setting. Also, with approach distances greater than 4 nautical miles, the runway image will appear relatively small, which will subsequently make it more difficult to estimate the correct runway aim point setting. Since the visual difference between setting the runway threshold image on the correct or incorrect windscreen position is often only a fraction of an inch, aim point placement errors that occur beyond 4 nautical miles may not be perceivable until the aircraft is within 3.5 nautical miles of the airfield. Fortunately, by observing the sight picture dynamics of the runway lights and glare shield, pilots can visually determine if their glide path is set on the runway or short of the airfield. After the approach has been stabilized, if the visual image of the threshold lights is slowly moving downward on the windscreen and the far-end runway lights are moving upward, this is a clear indication that the aim point is set on the runway. In contrast, any upward visual movement of the threshold image indicates the aim point is set in front of the runway, and ground impact will occur if flight path corrections are not made. Also, when the aim point is short of the threshold, the runway will often appear to suddenly flatten out approximately 2 nautical miles from the threshold. Any appearance of runway flattening is a clear indication the aircraft is well below glide slope and nearing ground impact. To prevent disorientation and perceptual problems that can lead to dangerously low black hole approaches, the most important thing to remember is, regardless of what visual illusions you encounter at night, keeping up a good instrument scan of distance, altitude, and airspeed will help maintain the proper flight path and reduce the chances of committing black hole errors. Also, knowing the terrain elevation along the approach path and knowledge about the location of any flight path obstacles, such as towers or wires, can further reduce the risk of mishaps during night landing approaches.